So what I'm going to spend the next sort of 15-20 minutes talking to you about, or what we're going to talk to you about, is what is that research, how is it different, but at the same time, what are the common themes that run through it as well. So we are very different. My PhD is in environmental science, so I use chemistry to answer questions about the environment. Micky's PhD is in education. So two completely different subjects. There is not much crossover between chemistry and how we learn. But what we do share as a common theme is that we both had questions in our PhD research that our subjects didn't currently have the tools to be able to answer. And so we started off both of our PhDs with that in mind. So I'm going to talk to you about my research, and then I'll hand over to Micky and he'll explain his, and then we'll talk about how it's all related to Let's Talk About X. So my research started off here. So one of the most significant changes in human history happened around 6,000 years ago. And that change was the transition from us living as hunter-gatherers to farming. So instead of running around with spears, killing deer, we changed to quite a sedentary lifestyle, whereby we raised cattle and we grew crops, and the whole way that we ate and lived changed. So farming is important because now all our food was in one place. It meant that we could stay in one place. So instead of moving around to find food, we could settle down and build houses and work as a group to build towns and villages and cities and governments. So essentially farming is where we get civilized society, us. That's where we come from, is this advent of farming. And farming is so essential and so efficient that it's how we feed the entire world today. So this is an important time in history. However, we don't really understand what's going on there. So the change between hunting and gathering to farming, we're not quite sure what that looks like. And the reason for that is because of the evidence that's available to us. So we've got the archaeological evidence, of which there are many, many hundreds of tons of shells. So that would suggest that we're eating shellfish in the Neolithic times, which is this new farming age. However, when you use a very reliable and very proven chemistry technique that looks at an individual's bones to reconstruct diet, you can't actually see any evidence of eating fish or shellfish. So there's conflicting evidence so we don't know what's happening between these two periods. So I came at it from the chemistry point of view, and I'll use this lovely gentleman up here to illustrate the technique. So the technique is called isotope analysis, and it essentially works on the premise that you are what you eat. So when you eat your food, your body breaks it down, and any protein in that food goes to build your body tissues. So your skin and your bones and your hair is all literally made of the food that you eat. Although, because bones replace themselves slowly over time, you're actually what you ate over the period of about the last 10 years. So that means that the food that you eat over 10 years is kind of mapped into our bones, but as a blur, it's all homogenized. What that does mean, though, is that when we get skeletons from the ground, such as this guy, the dietary signals, the unique dietary signals from the food is still in the bone. It's preserved there because that's literally what the bone is made of. So what we can do is take that bone, and this is how it relates to dissolving dead people. If we can take that bone, we can break the bone down in acid to get at the protein, and then we can further break down that protein by combustion to then look at the individual chemical elements that the food that comes from the food that makes up the bone. So that means that we can tell from somebody's bone what they used to eat, basically. There's two problems with applying that, though, to the question of this transition to farming. So number one, to be able to understand the transition to farming, we need to be able to understand very small changes in diet. So the technique works in quite a vague way, whereby you can say, oh, this person ate a lot of fish, or this person ate a lot of meat. But if they ate just a tiny fraction of their diet from fish, you're not going to be able to see that. So that's problem one. We also have another problem because we need examples of what was available at the time to measure their isotopes to then be able to compare to the human values. And in this period, we have all these tons of shells, but none of the actual food. The food part, the shellfish has, funnily enough, been eaten. So we don't have that available to measure. So that's where I kind of started with my PhD. So if I was able to refine that technique, to refine that chemistry approach, it would help us to answer the question about the origin of, where we came from. But also it would benefit lots of other different scientific disciplines as well. So disciplines such as forensic science, ecology and zoology, as well as archaeology, they all use this isotope technique to answer various questions. So if you can refine the technique for one discipline, you can actually apply it across others as well. So this is how I did that. So I first took measurements of modern food, so modern fish bones, and I compared those measurements to the measurements of ancient fish bone. And it turned out that they matched. So that's good. So then that meant that I could take modern food sources from the same environment, so shellfish flesh, and use those to provide the comparisons that we needed that was missing up until that point. I can then measure the bones of the people who lived shortly after this transition into farming, and then I can refine the results using a computer-based statistics package to apply a sense of probability to the dietary reconstruction. And what this all meant was, so before my research, using isotope analysis would involve statements such as, this individual consumed the majority of their dietary protein from terrestrial sources. So you could say, before my research, they ate a lot of meat. That's not very helpful, though, in this scenario. So what my research did was, we're now able to say, this person ate about 75% of their protein from terrestrial resources, so they got 75% of their diet from meat. But they also got 20% of their diet from marine fish and 5% from shellfish. And this is important in the question that I asked, because what we can say now is that this person, who is one of the first farmers in Scotland, this skull is actually on display in the Huntarium. This person, one of the first farmers, and was still hunting and gathering. So there was some continuity between these two periods. It wasn't a complete change, and there was some continuity of behaviour. So although we are farming and things have changed in society completely, we do still take over some previous habits from the period before. So what my PhD did was slightly settle the argument between this archaeological evidence and the scientific evidence. My research only looked at sites in Scotland, and you'd need to expand that a lot to be able to say anything about the origins of farming globally. But what it also did was, we now have a technique that can be used by ecologists, zoologists, and forensic scientists to make their isotope results much more refined. So my research can tell you a little bit about where we come from, and Micky can tell us how we actually learn together as a group. So taking the same approach, but in a completely different subject. So I'll hand over to Micky.
Thank you very much. Hi, so I have worked in education for a really, really long time, and I have always been really interested in how we learn as adults and how we learn as adults in higher education. So I did my PhD in this exact topic, and I had a question, and this question always came from teaching, and it was, why does so much group work not work? Why does so much of it go wrong? And I'm sure everyone's been in a group where that group hasn't worked very well. And I thought I would go and investigate this. Now, we learn in groups a lot. So therefore, making group work really matters. It matters to having successful learning. And actually, in theory, if you work in a group, you should get more out of it than just the sum of its parts, yeah? In theory. Also, making group work is an amazing graduate attribute, because when you graduate and go into the workforce, you're going to have to work with other people, you're going to have to navigate those groups, and you're going to have to get things out of people and make it work. Also, I believe that if we could have successful group work, actually learning would be more enjoyable, which is something which we hardly ever talk about, which I think is quite important. So what did I do to get my data and to get this theory? Well, in simple terms, I went and spoke to learners. Yeah? I listened to their narratives, to their stories, and I tried to understand what it was like for them to be a learner. And ultimately, I kind of drew some dots, yeah, from what they told me. And then I tried to think about what was between those dots and to try and theorize. And I eventually made some theories which brought a new perspective to give us a new way which we can look at groups to try and understand why they go wrong and maybe how we can get them to go better. So I will introduce you to one of these theories. So I found in my research that in any given group, there's typically 3 types of people. I'm going to introduce you to the first person, which is the entitled person. Now, we've all come across the entitled person, and they are people who feel like they own the learning space, yeah? They're like the proprietors of that space. And they view other people in the space as tenants, or they may be squatters even, and they're not kind of happy with that. They know what they want, and they're very individualistic, and they try and get it. They look at things in a very narrow way, and because they look in this narrow way, they don't see what's around them, and they typically don't develop intercultural skills, etc. The next person in the group is limited. And they and the way are the opposite of the entitled. They feel like they're tenants on the space. They feel like they're renting, like a short-term lease, yeah? They can't act in the space. They find it really difficult to see what's going on and to navigate that space. They quite often end up having privatized, quiet experiences. However, we have another person who is quite different from these two, and this is the mindful person in the group. They don't see things as proprietary or renting. They see the space as a cooperative kind of space. They have a wide lens, and with it they can see quite a lot. They're interculturally aware, and because of this, they're able to navigate space and to get a lot out of people. So they're kind of the people that we want to have in groups. So what can we see with this theory? So let's imagine that our group looks like this before my theory. When we put the theory on it, we can see something different. I'm going to show you a couple of situations. So, for instance, a situation might look like this. In this situation, we have a large number of limited people. They're not really able to act in the group very well. They feel like they don't own the space. However, they see 2 other people who believe that they do own the space. These people end up taking charge. These are the entitled people. However, they're not happy about it because what are they getting out of it? They're only helping these people. Let's take another situation. This time we have too many entitled people, and it's actually a little bit scary for everybody, yeah? For teaching, it's scary, or if you are in the middle as the limited people, you're actually quite frightened and you can't speak. This one is my third one. I've put in 2 parts. This is really, really typical, and I've seen this when I go into a classroom. Actually, even though no one knows about this theory, they self-organize and sit in their own groups, where all the limited people huddle together, not saying very much. The entitled people sit at the back, not being particularly happy with what's going on, and a few mindful people are dispersed. However, these are all bad situations, yeah? All about group work not working. But we could make it work if we were all kind of mindful as educators and as learners. We could reorganize the space to try and make it work better, where the mindful people could bridge the gaps between those who are entitled and limited. Of course, I actually am quite an idealistic person, and I would like my research to go to a space like this, where we have much more mindful people, because then our group work would work and we would all get much more out of it. So my question is, how on earth do we do this? And this is hopefully where my research is going to go. So just to sum that up, by creating this theory, I've opened up a new way in which we can look at a situation. And in social research, we can look at the same thing, but now see something different. So my question for you is, which group member do you think you are? I hope it's the mindful one, but maybe it should be the mindful one if it's not.
So, me and Micky have very different topics, very different research subjects, but despite the differences in our subjects, we both have the commonality of the pursuit of clarity. We both had questions in our subjects that we needed to improve tools that currently existed to be able to answer those questions. And it's probably the only thing that we have in common in terms of our PhD research, even though we work in the same department. But that's not a bad thing. Actually, that's what we are going to be kind of celebrating over the next couple of days, is the fact that all our presenters are doing really different research in different subjects, but we're going to be communicating that in an accessible way. So it's a chance to kind of talk about our very different research and to tell you all about our different research as well.